Yeah,
So,
I mean, it's terrifying. Quick, before you go, what is the anthrax story from 2001? Because I remember that. I remember how absurd it is. And I want you to just go into that just while I have you here. What is the anthrax story? Because I remember how absurd and ridiculous that was. They all pinned it on one guy. And
yeah. Wow. So that's not a quick thing to answer.
Right.
And it's actually really important to go over it. So
Yeah, you have the
give me
time.
a little bit here, because one of the things we've been hearing, a buzzword we've been hearing a lot lately, is dark winter.
Right.
Right. It's going to be a dark winter, darkest winter, and all of that. Well, in June 2001, there was a bioterror simulation by what is now the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, which also did Event 201 last year and things like that. And it was called Dark Winter, and it included former CIA directors, former FBI directors, and a lot of other prominent national security officials, and predicted a lot of things that would later come to take place just a couple months later during the anthrax attacks, including anthrax being sent through the mail, that anthrax letters would be received by members of the media, and also the initial narrative of the bioterror attack itself, which was that Saddam Hussein was working with Al-Qaeda to enact a bioterror attack on the U.S. This was all gamed out in June 2001, and then the anthrax attacks are revealed to the public in October 2001. And that was the initial narrative, that it was anthrax from Iraq. And that Al-Qaeda had been involved in all of this stuff. Of course, it later was revealed that the anthrax used in the attacks was a strain exclusive to the U.S. military and had to have come from either a U.S. military lab or a U.S. military contractor. So the whole narrative that it must have been Iraq and Al-Qaeda eventually started to fall apart. But a lot of people that had been involved in Dark Winter tried to run with that narrative for as long as possible. And what's also important is that in the period between September 11th and when the anthrax attacks actually took place, a lot of these people that had been involved in Dark Winter, like Jerome Hauer, for example, had apparent foreknowledge that anthrax was going to take place. So you have, for example, Jerome Hauer on the day of 9/11 telling people that they need to start taking an antibiotic to prevent anthrax infection. This was going on at Dick Cheney's office in particular. And then just a couple days after 9/11, Dick Cheney was personally briefed by the people that created the Dark Winter exercise about Dark Winter. And all of this stuff. And then you have a bunch of the Project for a New American Century think tank neocons, of which Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld were members, going on national media saying anthrax, talking about anthrax constantly. You also had a member of the media that was at Dark Winter, Judith Miller, being involved in writing several articles between September 11th and when the anthrax attacks took place, talking about anthrax and bioterror, Al-Qaeda and anthrax and all of this stuff, sort of seeding this narrative, and those attacks end up taking place. And what's really crazy, too, about anthrax is the FBI investigation itself, which was called Amerithrax. It took them almost a decade to officially close that case. It was hugely criticized, not just by people at the National Academy of Sciences, but also by one of the lead investigators of the investigation for the FBI itself. Their lead investigator, Richard Lambert, actually ended up filing a whistleblower lawsuit saying that the FBI's investigation into the anthrax attacks was a giant cover-up. And that's from the guy that was investigating it for the FBI itself. They pinned it on Bruce Ivins before they could take it to trial. Bruce Ivins committed suicide, even though he was under 24/7 FBI surveillance. And so they didn't actually have to prove their case against him in court because he conveniently dies right before they take it to trial. And, really, I would argue the anthrax attacks remain unsolved. But if you actually look into some of the companies that stood to benefit most from anthrax and what they were doing at the time, it's very revealing about some possible motives. And that is very alarming. And I don't know if you want me to go into this if there's time. But the company that gained the most from the anthrax attacks, which was called Bioport at the time, they're now called Emergent Biosolutions. They're actually manufacturing the COVID-19 vaccine for Operation Warp Speed.
Fun.
Yeah.
So these anthrax attacks could have been just like a false flag to like, let's get us into Iraq quicker. Let's start tying
well,
the
weapons
narrative.
of mass destruction thing, right? So you had the big event of 9/11, but then it was a lot of the anthrax fear that conditioned people to think, oh, the terrorism in the U.S. is now going to be a way of life.
Yeah, bioterrorism. Yeah, it wasn't enough 9/11. We needed the bioterrorism angle. I remember Time magazine, the sarin gas, the Japan, the photos, like they were really pushing that narrative hard. And anthrax was...
Right, and a lot of those very prominent people involved with the cover-up of the anthrax attacks and in very shady positions in the lead-up to those attacks are also very involved in COVID-19 response right now.
Right.
One of them is the guy that was also very intimately involved in the Dark Winter exercise. His name is Robert Cadlick. He's currently the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at HHS and managing COVID-19 response on behalf of HHS. And he's the guy that gave the COVID-19 vaccine a complete liability. Anyone that administers or manufactures that vaccine can't be liable. And Emergent Biosolutions, the company I mentioned earlier, he used to be a lobbyist for them. And has been just involved in a lot of really crazy stuff over the past couple of years, basically, huge conflicts of interest with that particular company, which has very shady ties to the 2001 anthrax attacks.
How is the country that you're in doing with COVID-19?
It's a mess.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Chile is a U.S. client state, so I mean, it's basically following a similar playbook, but it's a lot more draconian than even what's going on in the U.S. And that's because after the 1973 coup, backed by the CIA and Henry Kissinger, that installed the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile, it's basically been used as a laboratory by the U.S. power structure for different things, whether it's neoliberalism, for example, was essentially born in Chile, they say, because they used it as a giant laboratory for that. But also, I would argue some of the more draconian COVID-19 responses that we may see in the next couple of weeks in different states in the U.S. Had they been piloting some of that out here. So since March, for example, there's been curfews in Chile. They have a 5-phase lockdown system where they constantly move cities back into lockdown based on faulty data, I would argue, because the Minister of Health admitted that he was making up numbers not that long ago after he resigned. He was pretty blatant about it because there's no accountability really in Chile like the U.S. But I would argue it's would you
ever come back to America to get assassinated?
I'd have to think about it. I don't know. I mean, I have a toddler too, so I mean, just even the idea of getting on a plane with a little kid and have to make her wear a mask the whole time for an overnight flight, doesn't really appeal.
But you got to go on a book tour. If you finish the Epstein book, you got to go on a book tour.
Well, if America's still left, I'll think about it.
Well, we'll see. If America's not left, I don't think Chile will be left either.